Hi, everybody. Welcome to Redesigning Normal podcast. I'm here with my guest, Blake DeYoung. Hi, thank you for joining me so much.
Good morning.
So, Blake, can you tell me a little bit about your school that you're involved in and your role there?
Sure. Bellevue Christian School is an independent school out in the Seattle area. We started in 1950, so we've been doing this a long time. I myself am actually an alum of BCS, so I had a career as a teacher and an administrator at other independent schools, and then came back here about 6 years ago and served for 5 years as the principal of our secondary campus, our middle school and high school campus, where we have about 500 students on that campus and about 1,000 in the system overall. And then last year, just before the world turned upside down, we started talking about my moving into a different role at the school. So now I oversee admissions and fundraising, marketing, communications, all that sort of business side. So it was an interesting time to make the transition,
Sure.
right into a role that had to think differently about the way the world looked and how we were going to operate.
So I would imagine people right away are like, "Are you going to have school? Like, are my kids going to be going to school?"
Yeah, I mean, everything happened so fast, and I think that everybody, organizations and individuals and families, all spent those first, I don't know, 4 to 6 weeks just trying to find their footing and looking around at others, and trying to have a sense of stability. And it felt to us like once we were able to establish what the short term was going to look like, the short term meaning kind of that first month, which then quickly became the end of last school year. People just were ready to be led, and
Mhm.
whatever stability and certainty we could provide was graciously accepted. I think the question that you brought up, kind of the like what now,
Mhm.
really started to emerge, at least for schools, kind of in the summer. And once we started realizing that this wasn't going to be a 2 week thing, and then it wasn't going to be a 2 month thing, um, we the summer presented that second chapter where it's like, okay, simply providing a reasonable, in our case, remote school alternative was not going to work for the 2021 school year. We needed to really get our stuff together, and provide something that was a very compelling experience, a very compelling product for our families who, I mean, let's be honest, they do have other options. And so we were hard at work in the first half of the summer, really building a valuable product for our families. And I think that's borne out over the course of the year in ways that we can probably talk about here this morning.
Yeah, let's get into it. I mean, I would love to hear, like, how did you allay the fears of these folks through, whatever criteria to make sure that they're going to get the value and that they're going to be safe? And this is
Right.
exactly what this podcast is about. So,
Right. It's funny that we've been, the metaphor, if you're flying the aircraft or you're building the aircraft as you're
of
flying it,
course.
or you're going down the rushing river or whatever. Like it took me a while. It was several months before I went back, almost as a history lesson, and started looking at like how we handled this as a school, because obviously it wasn't something that anybody saw coming with a lot of advance notice. So I was a little bit curious, as we got into this year, like, what is it that we did? What were the circumstances that allowed us to kind of thrive in this? Because if you look at any sort of metric right now, we're thriving. I mean,
Okay.
this has been an opportunity, a forced opportunity, but still an opportunity for us to um, kind of reset how we do things, and also, honestly, to reset um, our sort of position in the landscape of independent schools in the Seattle area. So I was like, I mean, what was it? Because it's not like we're some um, it's not like we're elitist or we're the smartest people in the room or anything like that. There were some circumstances that allowed us to be kind of out in front, and among those was obviously the Seattle area was one of the first places in the country where this sort of started getting news, and we were having our first conversations about this really back in kind of the middle of January, which is a lifetime when you think about it. If you've got like an 8-week window between the middle of January and the middle of March when we went out, when schools in the Seattle area shut down and everything kind of came to a halt. 8 weeks instead of 6 or 4 or 2 is a lifetime. So we were having really kind of elementary conversations and really basic conversations way back in early January that just I think allowed us to be kind of on the forefront of thinking about this, right? So it was at first like, gosh, we should kind of be paying attention to this. Like
Uh-huh.
this could impact our business. And then pretty quickly that shifted for us. Some of the first conversations were really around discrimination and assumptions about where the virus was coming from and what that meant for caring for members of our own community, students that that were from China or that had relatives that were visiting from China. All that those were like the late January, early February kind of conversations for us.
Before this is even like in the U.S. En
Yeah, I
masse,
mean, it was like a
right?
few, those few cases early on, nothing that would have.
Wow.
The early conversations for us were really just around that, like, and also sort of okay, so it evolved from, hey, let's make sure that our Chinese students in particular are being well cared for, and then it became, well, gosh, we've got some school breaks coming up. Do we need to think about guidance for travel between, in particular the U.S. and China, or even just global travel? That was a long time before we started having conversations about, totally redeveloping our model, our educational
Hmm.
model. But because we were having those conversations in late January, by the middle of February, we were starting to have more serious conversations about, geez, what are we going to do if this disrupts our ability to be in person? It's kind of that far-reaching scenario where you're really grappling with like a topsy-turvy world.
Hmm.
I think we were able to get there before a lot of other schools. And it didn't feel like wasted time for us, even though it was like, well, gosh, is this really going to happen? Are we really talking about, a world where we're not going to come to school in person? We were having hypothetical conversations a good 4 or 5 weeks ahead of when that happened, which gave us a huge lead time. And then we're honestly just fortunate to have some really, really smart people in the organization who took the reins on um, sort of reimagining remote education and started to, I mean, it was such a complex landscape because we're even from a technology hardware standpoint, we weren't a one-to-one school. So
Hmm.
we had to we had to just ramp that up, and of course that in itself was its own sort of arms race, everybody trying to quickly just get inventory of devices. And again, that's one of those examples where being ahead of that conversation by a week makes a massive difference in working with vendors.
Wow.
So it was a scramble from, I would say, probably about 3 to 4 weeks before we actually went out. I mean, it was at that point, it was daily meetings with kind of the core team.
Hmm.
And we weren't thinking about to give pay homage to the title of the podcast here. It wasn't like completely redesigning normal permanently. We were like,
Yep.
okay, well, how are we going to get through this? Because the other thing for us is during that season, during that sort of 4 to 8 week window, we're also smack in the middle of re-enrollment for next year. So it is not a time where you want to be um, where you want questions coming up about the value of what people are investing in, right?
Hmm.
The last thing you want during that time is some sort of disruptive event that causes people to go, well, they kind of botched that.
Right.
And then on the flip side, it's also an opportunity or a season where if you have an opportunity to shine, it's a great time to affirm that value.
Sure.
If Bellevue Christian School um, is able to demonstrate that we think well, that we have the capacity to execute on a completely new normal and find our footing um, more quickly than other organizations, that is a great opportunity for us to for our
Yep.
profile to rise. And so then we were, I don't know, I think we decided to suspend in-person classes about 2 or 3 days before Jay Inslee, our governor in Washington, shut everybody down, shut all schools down, and it was initially for a period of about 3 weeks. But again, it was one of those things like if we're able if we're able to just be ahead of that,
Hmm.
it's like that sweet spot. You don't want to be the first to close or to
Right.
suspend. You don't want to look like you're being reactionary. And we had some schools, both public and independent, in the Seattle area that did that. Like they were kind of like, well, we're going to close first, and then they wound up going back on that,
Right.
and then the mandate comes down, and it's like, well, you weren't in control of your own destiny. You're only closed now because the governor said. And so instead of being able to say we did what was best for our organization, um, it's more like, well, we're just going along with what the governor mandated. And Bellevue
Sure.
Christian, fortunately, was able to be out in front of that, as I said, by 2 or 3 days.
Wow.
So yeah, that's kind of how it
So
went.
what you're describing, if what I hear is like a really strong decision making body, right? Like you must have a team that is like really good at analyzing, right?
Well,
What's going on?
I mean, Andrew, we found out that we were good at that.
That's amazing.
There wasn't a plan, and it wasn't as if, some organizations probably have some kind of manual on the shelf for, like, okay, well,
Right.
if you're in an unprecedented situation that fits sort of these categories, here's the team that's going to come together and the process by which they're going to make decisions. We didn't have that on the shelf.
Okay.
um, but
You didn't
but
have
we
your pandemic handbook ready to
no,
go?
no.
Huh.
And as I said, you're doing, and this is a metaphor for education as a whole, but you're doing something a certain way for, in our case, 70 years, or in the case of sort of American education, you're doing something a certain way for 150 years. And all of a sudden, here comes the pandemic that says, well, you can't operate that way anymore. You
Mhm.
just you just can't. And so good luck. And we sometimes it's better to be lucky than good, and sometimes it's ideal to be both. We were both lucky and good. We were lucky in the sense that this thing got our attention sooner than probably in some other organizations. And we were lucky in the sense that we had some really good people that were on the payroll and that got drafted into the meetings and the decision process at the right time, and were able to lead through some of the most complex layers of executing this pivot in the spring.
Did you also query like peers in other markets to see what they were doing, or were you kind of doing it on
Well,
your own?
not so much in other markets, because the Seattle area was one of the first markets to really grapple with this.
Right,
So
right.
we certainly, I mean, if this is a podcast about leadership and other people listening, it's a great reminder of the value of having um, those close connections on speed dial, those other educational leaders or organizational leaders, where
Sure.
it's not so much, in those days, it's not so much a system, right? Well, I'm on this email exchange or this list serve with other educational leaders, and every week we have a chat or something. No,
Right.
it's like, I need to pick up the phone right now. I need to make a decision in the next 10 minutes on this issue or
Hmm.
hour or whatever it might be. And I need to talk to, my colleague over at, the neighboring school or whatever, and say, "Hey
Got it.
guys, how are you navigating this? what's your own community, sort of chatter about this? And it was a very supportive local independent school kind of environment in
Wow.
those early days of just being able to reach out and go, help us think well about this. And then, fortunately for us, we were on the receiving end of those calls too,
So you can
which is
sort
a
of
good feeling to
learn.
be able to just
Yeah.
share best practices and current thinking. Yeah, no
Um,
problem.
okay, so now we're into, well, once you hit the summer, you've got a natural break, right? Which
Right,
coincides
right,
with a dip in sort of U.S. infections, and everything's
right,
looking a little bit better, right? But everyone's kind of concerned about the fall, and as they should be, right? If you look at the
right.
data now, and right away, I'm just sort of making up this scenario, but I think it's probably true. All those people that you enrolled, and all those families that were already enrolled and have gone legacy families and all that stuff, are starting to ask in July or whatever, hey, what are we doing in September or late
Right,
August?
right.
So, and you're saying back, what do you say?
Well, I'll tell you, one of the interesting things for us was, that the way we responded in the spring was visibly superior to what um, w- um, a lot of other families were experiencing, particularly in the public schools. I mean, and I'll just be
Yep,
honest, and it's not about. There are lots of reasons for why that is. There's resourcing reasons for that. There are labor relation reasons for that. Like
sure,
what Bellevue Christian School and I think what other independent schools were able to accomplish in the spring. Um, was impressive in part because of those things I mentioned. Also, scale. I mean, it was a challenge for us to figure out how we were going to get 1,000 devices in the hands of students in a 1 week period. But it's a lot easier for us to do that than it is for a public school district that's got 20,000 kids in it or 50,000
right,
kids in it in the
and
case of.
certain like procurement like
Yeah,
hurdles and
yeah.
whatnot, right?
But we were able to do it, and our own internal people noticed and were immediately appreciative. And it was
Hmm,
funny because um, all the little things that can pull at school culture, all the things that all the frustrating things that seem so important, um, and can just kind of drag on a school culture. Those things just evaporated in the spring, right? It was like people were grateful, people were appreciative, people were impressed.
huh,
And even though our launch wasn't perfect and it was a disruption from what normal had been, it it was still it was still visibly uh, different and better than
sure.
what the kids were experiencing down the street in your neighborhood. And so all that to say, we ended the spring, we ended last school year with quite a bit of wind at our back, quite a bit of momentum, and that hadn't yet translated to new enrollment. But the people that had been at Bellevue Christian for the 2021 school year um, were saying good things, and
Hmm.
they were positively engaged, and there was a lot of positive buzz kind of out there in the community about what BCS had done. Again, that was in the 2021 school year.
Right.
To your point, we hadn't really started figuring out yet what we were going to do in 21-22, and part of that was because Ju- June was too early to start making those determinations. It wasn't too early to be talking about it for
Right.
sure. And we really worked hard in 2021 to keep our eye on the ball and like finish that school year well. And we had the educational model nailed down, but you have all kinds of events and rituals and all that stuff at the end of the year that are important for organizational culture.
Hmm.
We weren't going to be able to do them in any sort of normal sense. I mean, high school graduation is a classic example, but we've got 10 to 12 of those events that we need to rethink. So that kept us very busy through kind of late May and early
What
June.
did you do? Did you did virtual versions of graduation?
We did a lot of virtual. and for smaller type events like our the award ceremonies and the sixth grade graduation
Hmm.
ceremonies and things like that. We did our school auction. We did a lot of virtual versions for that. With when it came to high school graduation, we really wanted to do something in person, and so we kept kicking it down later and later into the summer.
Hmm.
And in hindsight, we kicked that one a little bit too late. We missed a window in early July when we probably could have had it. We
Right.
had a vision for an outdoor ceremony here at the school, kind of in the parking lot, um, and then we kicked it into late July. And by the time we were ready to have it, the state came out with some guidance as cases started to sort of tick back up there in the middle of the
Right.
summer, and they said, well, you can't have even outdoor gatherings with more than, I think it was 25 people or something. And so um, we made the decision about a week ahead of that event to cancel it, and that was pretty devastating
Imagine. Yeah.
for families. Understandably so. It was one of the first times in that sort of 6 month window that we really got some negative pushback from
Hmm.
those families. As I said, through most of the spring and summer, it had been, one attaboy pat on the back after another, because we were generally making really really good decisions in the
Right.
landscape that we were having, and that was one. I think it was the right decision, but it's an important event in a family's life, and our decision to cancel it based on the state's guidance was one that was tough for a lot of families.
Sure. No,
But
it makes sense. It makes sense. I was just thinking as you were talking. I went to a private school in Princeton, New Jersey, a place called Princeton Day School, and when I just vaguely remember, like, if someone came to school and they like had the flu, they went to the nurse's office, right? They sat there for part of the day, and then their parents came and got them.
right.
And that was probably true for your school in,
Hmm.
let's say, January 2020. That's exactly what every school would do, right? If a kid came to school sick in January 2021,
Yeah.
like, what did it what does it look like in January, or now, or in February? What does it look like now for a student coming to coming to school? And by
Yeah.
the way, I'm assuming that you're open now. We haven't
We
actually
are.
talked
We're in
about.
person.
Okay.
Yep, we're in person, and we have been all year, for the most part.
Okay.
Which kind of gets to your earlier question about the anatomy of how we made those decisions over the summer, and maybe we'll circle back to that,
Yes.
and I'll just talk briefly about our protocols today,
Sure.
which is part of our reopening plan, obviously. So um, we, as you can imagine, the uh, the product and vendor landscape is a little bit like the Wild West right now, and that emerged in the summer, right? It was all kinds of, and you know that well from your own business, but it was all sorts of new products coming on the market, and we think we can help with this, and just, I mean, sorting through that as an organization. um, what are the products out there that are really good? What are the products out there that are actually really dependable, that have been tested? And what is kind of the, who are the snake oil
Yeah.
salesmen out there that are trying to take advantage of an opportunity? So we wound up selecting like a health management reporting app that our families
A trust
use.
app. Yeah, a trust app.
Yeah. Yep.
Cool.
And so it's a little bit different at our elementary schools versus our secondary campus. When our middle and high school students show up, they we have three designated checkpoints for campus entry, and you can't get into the perimeter of campus without going through one of those entry points. And we do temperature scans, and we have them sign in physically, and their signature designates that they don't have, any of the following symptoms.
Got it.
It's a little bit of hygiene theater. You're probably familiar with that phrase.
We call it confidence theater. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
Hygiene theater.
but it was a relatively small lift for our staff. You know what I mean? Like, so to be able to, like, physically reconfigure campus and then to staff those checkpoints on a daily basis, it's not actually that much work,
Okay.
and it has other benefits for us anyway. It's a great thing for a kid to show up every day on campus and be greeted by the same person who gives them, a little a friendly welcome to
Sure.
campus, and it's another checkpoint with an adult who cares about them. And so, I mean, pandemic aside, that's a good thing for kids. That's a good
Mhm.
thing for school culture. So um, it really it really was not that big of a deal, and it gave our community a sense of, as you said, confidence. Like, okay, well, they're taking it seriously, and here's what happens if if you show up and you have symptoms. That doesn't happen very often at all,
Right.
by the way. Because one of the things that we did, again, this is unique to the secondary campus, to middle and high school, is that our model there is to be in person, but all classes are live streamed every day. And so a kid, any given day, a kid can decide, you know what, I'm going to stay home and do school remotely today. And they don't have to tell us in advance,
Hmm.
or this has been the plan anyway, and it's worked out pretty well. But we've also learned some things about it, some things that we may do differently in the future. Um, but we so you go back to the summer, like, and this is, I think, applicable for sort of all businesses. You start looking at the resources that you need to deliver your product. Um, and there were all sorts of early questions about, well, the staffing side of this, and remote, like on the technology side, like what platforms do we want to use, and
Hmm.
what about what about things like camera quality and audio, and like all those things that, like, are really complicated to discern. But we also realized really early on that our ability to be in person was fundamentally a question of real estate. It was fundamentally a question of physical space. Like,
Space.
that was the biggest constraint that we were going to face. We didn't know for sure what the limitations were going to be on, like, distancing and all that stuff, but we knew the constraints were going to be constraining for us and what we were
Hmm.
typically used to. If we typically wanted to depend on being able to put 24 kids in a classroom or 22 kids in a classroom, we were going to be dealing with a reality that was more like 14 to 18. So if we don't have any more space. So how are we going to navigate that? Well, one way we can navigate it is to create a scenario where it is not just permissible, but might even be attractive for kids to stay home and do school remotely. If you got a class of 22, and your capacity in the room is 18, if you can get 4 to 6 kids to just stay home, and their learning is not compromised or diluted.
Right.
um,
Because you've invested in this technology and this, and like we've got it. It's solid. It's for every class, every grade.
Exactly. And that's
Okay.
where all that stuff starts to work together. And so
Okay.
you're having those conversations in July, and you're
Right.
sketching it out, and you're like,
Cool.
okay, well, this works on paper.
Hmm.
Now can we get our hands on the technology that we need, and can we get it installed in a timely fashion? Um, what are our teachers going to think about this model? Because in education, um, there's a whole hesitancy and skepticism and fear about having a camera in your classroom
Sure.
that is, like, deeply ingrained in sort of teaching culture.
Right.
um, that obviously got completely eroded by the pandemic, because now all of a sudden everybody is teaching in front of a camera, whether you're a teacher at home, sitting in your living room delivering lessons, or you're in person, but your lessons are now being recorded by a camera in your room.
That's
But there were
interesting.
questions about, are our families going to go for this? Like,
Right.
and how many will actually stay home? How many students will actually stay home? What if we
Right.
think 25% of them are going to stay home, but then none of them do? So we needed to have an overflow plan on campus. That was another
Was that
layer.
like tents or something? Because I've seen talked to some other people that did that.
Yeah, no, we looked at tents. What we wound up doing was, we said, okay, if we want this remote learning thing to be voluntary and not prescriptive
Yep.
by the school, we're going to enter into every day with a certain amount of unknowns. Like, we're not, if the classroom size capacity is 18, we're not actually going to limit the class roster to 18. We're going to limit it to 22. We're going to assume, and we did some surveying. I mean, we had some
Sure.
reasonable data on this, but we're going to assume that, 4 to 6 kids are not going to show up. But what happens when all 22 of them show up? We need a plan
Yeah.
for those kids, because we don't want to erode confidence. Back to the whole trust theater thing. We don't
Yep.
want to erode confidence that we don't take our own protocols seriously, and heaven forbid we don't take our protocols seriously, and then we have an outbreak. Then we're really, in trouble.
Yep.
Um, so we designated multiple spots on campus with large footprints, and they're basically just overflow rooms. Because keep in mind, unlike last year, now every kid's got a laptop.
Hmm.
So if you're kid number 19, and you show up to a classroom that has a capacity of 18, you go to the library and you attend class from the library,
Got it.
just as you would if you had stayed home.
Sure.
And then we kind of have a system for how kids are treated fairly in that process. So you're not the
Right.
same,
Exactly. Right.
kid number 19 isn't going to the library every time.
He's
But
always put in the closet. Right.
exactly. But then of course you're navigating. This is the joy and the challenge of working with kids, because a bunch of kids would probably rather do class from the library. So you've
Yeah.
got to, you sort of have to like navigate that. Are you showing up 1 minute late every day because you actually want to go to the library and do class with your
It's
friends? Because
funny.
that's not going to work. Um,
That is funny.
so
I have to say, like, I would be so happy to be a parent to send my kids to the way you're describing your setup, and also the way you're making decisions. I think is like would make me feel very comfortable. It sounds like you have thought further than I have as a parent.
well, that's what we want.
Yeah,
I mean, that's what you're paying us to do as a
it is.
parent, right?
Yeah, it is.
Um, and one of the I wouldn't. It's like I said earlier. It's not like we had this playbook that we pulled off the shelf. But as we've walked through the last 12 months, we have been very keenly attuned to, like, what are we learning here that are permanent lessons for how we should be operating in the future. And there are certain principles that have bubbled up, like principles of operation that have bubbled up. And one of them is, don't lock yourself into a decision framework before you have to. With schools, there were a lot of schools that were like, they were, and it's understandable why this would happen, because what do you crave in uncertain times? You crave certainty.
Certainty,
It's like,
of course.
okay, so if then, right? If case counts do this,
We're going to
here's
do
what
that.
we're going to do as a
Yeah,
school. Well, the problem with the pandemic, and something that is like globally as disruptive as this is, with no history, like history has become, operational history has become obsolete. What you used to bring to the table to help you make decisions is just not that valuable anymore,
sure.
because human behavior has changed so dramatically. And one of the things that we realized pretty quickly was, when it came to things like case counts and how those tied into like guidance from the state, those goalposts were moving all the time. So we learned pretty quickly, um, that flexibility was the name of the game, and not we didn't want to set ourselves up in an if then scenario and get ourselves locked into, like, oh
Sure.
well, case counts rose past X, so we're now going to be remote.
Right. Right.
And our local health department was very helpful in that regard, because they said late in the summer and then early in the fall, if you guys decide to open, we want you to stop paying attention to what's going on outside your walls, outside your school community. Because if you're operating, it really is about numbers within your own community and what's happening with any transmission within your school
Sure.
culture. So, during the fall, as in late September, those case counts really started going up, and there were schools in the area that had boxed themselves in a little bit.
Got it.
And then it's not that you can't change your mind as a school, But every time you change your mind as an organization, you lose a little bit of credibility, right? And it's
Wow. Yes.
like next time when you say you're going to do something, it's like, well, are you really going to do something?
Wow.
Um,
Yeah, that makes
and yeah, that was something that we continue to draw on that even now, because there's still uncertainty, about next year. Um, so we're trying to not create if then boxes, but we're trying to create scenario A, scenario B, scenario C,
sure.
right? And we may adopt one of them, or we may continue all three of them. It just
Wow.
depends.
I'm interested in a couple of the things that you mentioned. We could even do it rapid fire. How do you communicate with your people? Is it bulk emails always? Like what's your communication platform for your
Written,
families?
video communication. There was a lot of our head of school is doing a lot of videos over the course of the summer. We do town halls pretty regularly
Cool.
now, and then a lot of email.
Okay.
And we use a third party vendor for email communication, and we are paying attention to click through rates and all that stuff. And it's funny because
Awesome.
people read email, or
Yep.
they're thirsty for information. And our read rates are way, way, way higher than they used to be.
Right now it is because it's like concerning your day.
Exactly.
How about platforms for remote learning? Did you guys
Yeah.
have to choose one direction or another? What did you end up using?
Yeah, it's interesting. We chose two. Obviously, this was kind of a springtime, late February and early
Mhm.
March. Okay, well, we got Teams, we got Zoom, or we got WebEx. I mean, those were the three that we were really
Yep.
evaluating. And what are the strengths and the concerns with each? We we had a foothold with Teams. I wouldn't say we were widespread users by any stretch, but there was some level of institutional familiarity with
Because you're
Teams.
using 365 like for your admin stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, we were using it to a small degree in the classrooms. We had
Okay.
some individual teachers who had invested, but I mean, it's a classic initiative in an industry that is really burdened by inertia, right? I mean, education is a classic. Like, yeah, well, I'll look at Teams, when I have time, or maybe someday that'll be useful to me. Well, guess
Yeah.
what? It's February 2020, and it's useful now, so you better learn it.
Right.
And so what we did decide to do was we went with Teams. Um, Pretty exclusively for our secondary program. Actually, fifth through 12th grade. Not to get into the weeds on why
Sure.
fifth grade was included, but um, and we were using Teams as both a video platform and as a learning management system, an LMS. Pretty much that became kind of the clearinghouse for document transfers and all that
Okay.
sort of stuff.
Yep.
We went with WebEx for our K through 4 students, in part because they didn't have existing Teams accounts, and also
Right.
we had some concerns about privacy, and we liked WebEx for the younger kids a little bit better. Um, so yeah, I guess
So
that's
like
about
that
about the end of
remote
that.
that remote scenario where it's like if I'm a ninth grader and I just say, "Hey, mom, dad, like, can I just stay home? I'll do work online." I then log into Teams and I'm in my classroom team room.
Yep.
That's really cool.
Yep.
That is really
And
cool.
that model has been a massive lift for our teachers.
Okay.
We've kind of adopted calling that the high flex model, where as a teacher, you're essentially teaching the same class in two different platforms. One of which is, well, the two platforms from a pedagogical standpoint don't really work that well together. So, if you take, like, I don't know, if you take a classroom discussion, a Socratic seminar, or a group work, in particular, like a science lab, like
Right.
that takes two different class plans. Like the plan for the kids at home is going to be fundamentally different than the plan for the kids in the classroom. So
Sure.
now you've not only you probably haven't doubled your prep time, your planning time, but you've certainly increased it by a significant percentage. And then, oh, by the way, you also have to simultaneously kind of manage these two different populations. Um,
And questions from both.
and questions from both, and tech problems on the side of the kids that are at home.
Sure.
So it's a huge burden, and our teachers have been amazing. Our employees have been incredible at adapting, and then pulling themselves out of the frustration that comes with not only a complete change in how you work and how much you have to work, but also a total reframing of what success looks like. Because you let's say you've taught for 10 years a certain way, like you've got a certain expectation about how much your kids should have learned
Hmm.
by February 19th. Well, guess what? On February 19th, 2021, they haven't learned as much as they had in
Right.
previous
Surprise.
years.
Right.
And that we keep trying to um, put that back into the professional culture. Like, it's okay. You have to give yourselves permission for this to be okay. It's going to be frustrating. You got to build that into your expectations, and everybody thinks we're doing an amazing job.
Hmm.
So don't worry. And they just forget. They
Because
they
it's
you
like,
know they they,
right,
they fall back into that pattern.
eighth graders have always learned this by the end of February,
Yep.
right? In my last 12 years of teaching, and if they don't get there, then I'm falling behind. My job is to get them there by the end of February, and you have to give them permission to be like, this is a very unusual circumstance, right? Our programs are going to be delayed because of everything that's happened.
Yeah, yeah. And to get back into sort of the educational landscape overall too,
Mhm.
that's, I think, one of the advantages of being an independent school is
Sure.
we're just so much more nimble to modify the system moving forward, not just this year, but moving ahead. I mean, you've got um, a single system of fewer than 1,000 kids. You know what? If the eighth graders didn't get as far in history as they did last year, we'll figure it out. it's
Wow.
it's gonna be
Yep.
okay. And then that ties back into why credibility and good decision making becomes so important in this overall landscape. Is once you've established that trust, you can tell people it's going to be okay, and they'll believe you. You can
Right.
tell your parent community it's going to be okay, they'll believe you. You can tell your teachers it's going to be okay, and they'll believe you. And as long as you keep making good decisions, you'll retain the trust and credibility to make a statement like that, and have it ease the minds of the community and stabilize the culture. And that has been invaluable for us.
Wow. All right. All right. Let me ask you, what do you think is going to happen next? Like you've implemented all these things, right? And I think that you might have a better view onto this than many people that I speak with, because you guys are already, like, seems to me, months ahead of everyone else that I talk to. Okay, temperature checks. We've got, space concerns with overflow and remote learning, and maybe the teachers have headsets on now, I'm imagining, because they're like presenting to the class, but they also need to be able to be heard by the far distance learners. Is there a rush to get back to the exact way it was? Or do you think that there'll be lingering things that were good that we're going to keep forever? What do you
Right.
think might happen?
Well, I mentioned that 12 months ago, 13 months ago, we were kind of in the middle of re-enrollment. So that's the that's always a yearly, there's a yearly rhythm to January, and
Okay.
it's okay. Now we're going to communicate to our community about re-enrollment for next year. Well, the re-enrollment letter in 2021 tried to anticipate the unknowns, and we used it as a little bit of a transparent window into kind of how we were thinking about school for the 21-22 school year. Because obviously, if you're asking families to pony up a commitment, including a financial commitment, to re-enroll for next year when we're 9 months away from the start of school, they're gonna want to know kind of like,
What does it look
um,
like? Yeah,
yeah,
right. Is it,
what's it going to look like? And
yeah.
also, I mean, one thing that we haven't talked about is our enrollment increased dramatically this year. So over the course of the summer, we enrolled about 25% of our families this year are new to BCS.
Is that because people are moving out of the city center?
No, it's because people are moving away from public schools because they want to be in person.
And that's what you get in part from the private school education.
Yeah, and
Oh,
so that's a, I mean, 25% increase in enrollment is a wonderful thing for us
sure.
to navigate. But it also presents, where from an enrollment management standpoint, we're in an interesting scenario right now where we don't, again, I said before, like, your history doesn't mean anything. When 25% of your families are new and they came to you for what largely amounts to a transactional reason, like that's kind of the phrase that we use, like, oh, I'm interested in Bellevue Christian because of this tangible thing that it can give me, instead of maybe the school's mission, vision, philosophy, culture, those types of kind of more elusive reasons.
Hmm.
We're confronting the question right now: are these families going to stay, or when public schools go back, will they leave?
Right.
And ultimately, we don't know. We can look at certain metrics and try to wrap our heads around that, like philanthropic giving is one thing we can look at from our, especially from our first year families. Like, are they engaging
Hmm.
in a way that suggests a more permanent relationship? Because if you're swooping in for a year and then you're going to swoop back out, you're probably unlikely to support, from a fundraising and philanthropy standpoint. Re-enrollment is its own metric, and re-enrollment for us was off the charts positive this year. So that's a 3-week window. Typically, we would expect maybe 70 to 75% of our families to re-enroll in that priority re-enrollment time frame.
Right.
um, we're at about 95% re-enrollment.
That's actually, again, how close to the city are you? How close to
Well,
Seattle are you?
I mean, we're close. We're
Okay.
certainly in the metro area. We're one suburb over from Seattle itself, and then Bellevue is a pretty thriving commercial center on its own. So,
So because I'm thinking like from a New York perspective, a lot of people left New York, right?
uh-huh.
That were able to do so, and that can mean that like some things depress in terms of enrollment, and they end up being enrolled in the country
Right,
school, the
right.
day school, or whatever, right? It doesn't sound like you had that that you didn't have a problem.
No, we did not. We didn't do that. In fact, if anything, people moved out of the city center and into the suburbs a little bit more where we are.
Okay,
Um,
got
yeah.
it, got it. Um,
So yeah, we used re-enrollment to kind of say, okay, well, this is sort of what we're anticipating for next year, and what we're anticipating is, that there will still be some health protocols. Those will still be a thing that we'll want to adhere to. We think that there will be less pressure on class size, in terms of, the physical space between kids, but that some spirit of distancing will still be, part of school life. We anticipate that the vaccination will, have taken care of a lot of the concern about spread, all those things. So we tried to send a very clear message that we intend to be in person, and
okay,
that we think we will start to shift away from our remote delivery. Um,
okay. I was going to say
and
because otherwise there's no more snow days. Like
right,
there's no more days off because it's like you're always remote, right?
it's been one of the sort of humorous side conversations. Like, what do you do? I mean, and we've had literal conversations like, what do you do with snow days? Because
Okay.
you now, power outages aside, I mean, you now have the capability to deliver instruction during snow days.
Yep.
But should we? Because
Right.
snow days are, especially in the Seattle area, I mean, we don't get a ton of snow days, so when we do, it's a super, like, special thing. Like,
Sure.
do we want to, like, rob our kids of of the joy that comes when you wake up and you see snow outside and you're going to go outside and sled with your friends in the neighborhood or whatever. So we actually have a plan around snow days. We just had a big snowstorm last weekend, but it happened to come on days that were already off for us, so we didn't actually have to
Oh,
navigate
wow.
that decision.
I
But
say I say let them have the snow days for sure.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
that's been our approach.
well, Blake, I'm aware that like it's been a lot of your time, so I don't want to like take up too
It's
much of
fine.
your time.
Yeah, it's fine.
I just super appreciate all this color that you've given to your decision making. I don't know if you looked at all like what I've been doing recently, but I've been speaking with schools and other facilities that are like trying to reopen, and a lot of people are sort of a lot less put together than what you're describing. Right?
Well, thank
I'll
you.
just say that like and I've always, as a technology consultant, I've always moved like from different businesses, different cultures, to do a particular thing. It's like, going to do a surveillance system for this hotel and I'm going to work on this over here. So you kind of jump into like different organizations and you can see a big difference in the way that different organizations operate. Right. And it sounds like your community and your school has things really well put together.
I appreciate you saying that. Of course, it doesn't always feel that way. It's a little bit of the duck, he's gliding over the water and looks all smooth, and then underneath he's doing this. Um, but I'll tell you a couple just responses to that. I mean, like early on, I recognized that it was going to be critically important for the leaders of the organization to lead and
Mhm.
to not let people fall into sort of a helplessness of like, this is something that's happening to us and we're just going to have to wait it out. Like,
Right.
no, that's not how we're going to approach it. And then there's been a pretty big cheerleading component to this thing, and not just sending positive hunky dory emails. I mean, like really like a strategic approach to knowing um, who inside the organization on the employee side is really struggling right now, and
Right.
how can we support them. Um, who's going to go visit them and be in their classroom and give them give them some love, because we all feel that at times, and we'll be fine as an organization as long as we um, the frustration just shifts from one person to another,
Right.
at a time, and it doesn't overtake sort of the morale of the whole organization. And we've been really strategic about that. I mean,
Mhm.
about making sure that the frustration does not get a toehold, because the other thing about this is it's been a real positive clarifying moment for Bellevue Christian, and we kind of needed it. I mean, we were
Huh.
drifting along a little bit, and we weren't on a positive enrollment trajectory. And then all of a sudden this awful thing happens, and I'm not saying it isn't awful. I mean,
Right.
you know, all these cases and deaths and disruption to family lives, and it's obviously been a terrible thing for the educational system as a whole, and it's had a huge negative impact on kids in ways that we won't even understand for decades. But it's not going to be good. So I'm not saying, oh, aren't we glad that this pandemic came along? I'm not glad the pandemic came along, but it came
Right.
along, and there was nothing we could do about it. And so the
Right.
only thing that we could do was just to try to think well about the new normal. And and it's had a real resetting effect on multiple industries. Um, and we just kind of took an approach from an early stage that we were going to try to just use this to make us better. And I think it has in a lot of ways. I mean, it certainly arrested some of the concerning trends that we were confronting in terms of enrollment, but it's also proven a whole bunch, to ourselves and to our broader community about what we can be capable of,
Wow.
if we're confronted with really a remarkable challenge. And we can live off that for a long time, a long, long, long time, and we will we will use this to continue um, to say, look at how we can grow. Um, look at what we did during the pandemic. Now, what's the next challenge that we can face and tackle and be better,
Right.
because we've been able to overcome it.
Wow. Blake DeYoung, thank you so much for being on my podcast, Redesigning Normal. This was a great conversation, and I've got a lot to think about with all this. This is amazing.
Well, I appreciate that. It was very enjoyable, and we look forward to checking in with you down the road.
Thanks so much.